Charles, Anne, Andrew and Edward were conceived and born in the same way as most of us. But let's be frank, they're different.
Your Majesty, Mummy.
Like them or loathe them, we know their triumphs and disasters almost as well as those of our own families.
The monarchy was seen as the ideal family.
By whom?
By the country at large.
From glamorous youth to troubled middle age, no detail of their privileged lives, it seems, was too private to share.
Hello, Jeremy.
Have a seat. In this series, I'll meet some of the people who played a role at critical moments in the Royal Children's soap opera.
This is very exciting, being interviewed by the Great Inquisitor.
So it was true.
But I'm afraid I can't tell you who it was, Jeremy.
I'll revisit old haunts.
This is the photo from your time here.
And discover new reading matter. Do you think it's a picture album for the nation?
Yeah, I might steal that phrase.
To find out how the royal foursome's relationship with their mother...
It has turned out to be an annus horribilis.
...and each other...
Charles went apoplectic.
...seemed to threaten the crown itself.
That was a real bombshell.
And changed the British monarchy. Didn't change the flag since the last royal wedding. We're gathered here today to celebrate the marriage of Prince Andrew's daughter, Her Royal Highness Princess Eugenie, to a liquor salesman called Jack Brooksbank. It's a typically British affair of no particular importance, except to the people involved, of course, and their fans. That's very funny. Can you even see out of those glasses?
Yes, you can try it if you want.
Very good.
Yep.
Well, I'm very honoured. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
So you'd think the royal family might have had their fill of weddings for a while, but not a bit of it. This is the second royal wedding in Windsor this year. It's been 26 years since the Queen made that infamous speech in which she described 1992 as her annus horribilis. By then, the royal children had not only brought their mother to the end of her tether, but the House of Windsor itself to one of its lowest ebbs. Charles, Andrew, and Anne's marriages had all ended in spectacular scandal. The scheme had been to embody the monarchy within a royal family which was just like us, except that mother was a reigning monarch. And when it turned out that being like us involved all of our faults and misdemeanors, well, the public backlash was very real. In this program, I want to find out how, over the course of 2 painful decades, the royal family fought their way back from criticism and unpopularity to enjoy a new golden age. Nothing better demonstrates the tarnishing of the image of monarchy by the Queen's children than the almighty row which blew up at the end of the annus horribilis.
There are no words that can describe this scene. The sky aglow above Windsor as 1,000 years of history takes flame.
On the 20th of November 1992, the Queen received a phone call from Prince Andrew. The royal family's oldest home, Windsor Castle, was on fire. The Queen's favourite son felt his mother's pain.
Her Majesty's absolutely devastated. She is at present inside the castle, helping to take stuff out of it.
Restoring Windsor Castle to its former glory was going to cost an estimated £40 million. The government immediately announced that they, and by they meant us, would foot the bill. But the great British public's patience with the Queen and her children had by now worn so thin we were unwilling to cough up.
Isn't the truth of the matter that the Queen should pay the lot herself and not call upon impoverished taxpayers to have to foot the bill?
The British people were utterly fed up.
Historian and Republican Piers Brendan has a special interest in the monarchy.
I can remember it very well. These amazing things were brought out. It was a huge treasure trove. And they suddenly said, look, we're being asked to subsidize these immensely rich people. There was an indignation. You know, if my house burns down, I don't expect the Queen to pay for it. And if her house burns down, she shouldn't expect me to pay for it.
That change in public opinion wasn't just bad news for the Queen.
This is rather like a bad marriage, isn't it? It always defaults to money.
Yes, absolutely right.
Her feckless children were also about to feel the public's wrath. Punishment for their bad behaviour didn't come from the Queen. It came from the taxpayer, and it was swift. 6 days after the fire at Windsor, it was announced that the public would no longer fund the royal siblings. From now on, the Queen could pay for her children herself. If the royal family thought this would be enough to restore their reputation with the British public, they were wrong. Although Princess Anne was divorced and remarried in a very simple ceremony in Scotland, Charles and Andrew were only separated, not yet divorced, and things were about to turn ugly. Just as the scandal about the royal separations is beginning to die down, Prince Charles confesses in an interview with Jonathan Dimbleby to adultery. With that one confession, the Queen's eldest undermined all the financial penance done by Her Majesty. And then Diana seized control of the story. In 1995, two hi-fi salesmen arrive here at Kensington Palace. They are, in fact, the Panorama reporter Martin Bashir and his cameraman, and they're here in secret to conduct an interview with Diana. When the programme aired 2 weeks later, 22.8 million people watched as the princess famously told us there were 3 people in this marriage.
The interview with Martin Bashir was the most extraordinary interview, I think, almost in television history. It had a huge impact. At last it was seen that Charles had no sort of sense of empathy for her. She had suffered from these terrible bouts of bulimia and had tried to do her best to save the marriage, and there he was, a completely horrible and hopeless husband, and someone whom she said she hoped he would never become king. Now that was a real bombshell.
At this rate, people wondered whether the monarchy could withstand any more scandal. Luckily, Her Majesty had a plan to take back control from her wayward children. The first to uncover it was Sun reporter Phil Dampier.
In 1995, I had a tip from a contact that the Queen had summoned her children to what you could only describe really as a summit at Sandringham. The monarchy itself was in peril. You know, it was at such a low ebb, it was in such a terrible state that they had to do something.
This crisis meeting held at Sandringham was given a name, the Way Ahead Group.
And I think that was the turning point when the Queen said, enough is enough, you must now divorce, because we've got to draw a line under this. Somebody had actually overheard the conversation, and they discussed the fact that she was telling Charles and Andrew that they needed to get divorced.
But the first that the public knew about the existence of this ultimatum from the Queen was you.
Yes, it was. Yeah, I broke the story.
And where did you get it from?
I got it from a contact, but I'm afraid I can't tell you who it was, Jeremy.
Of course, I wouldn't expect you to tell me.
You know, if it's untrue, they were the first people to come down on you like a ton of bricks if something was wrong. So if they said no comment, or they didn't complain about it, that's good enough for me.
Having been read the Riot Act by Mummy, both Charles and Andrew were divorced within months. But the Way Ahead Group could never have foreseen the family tragedy that threatened to tarnish the crown forever. By the mid-1990s, Prince Charles was as sought after as a prawn cracker in a dirty ashtray. And when people are questioning the heir to the throne's suitability for the top job, the monarchy is in deep trouble. Charles was fighting the War of the Waleses. Problem was, his younger, much more glamorous ex-wife had long since won the popularity contest.
I, having reported on the royal family for several years by then, had got to know Diana's circle quite well.
Richard Kay was following the Waleses skirmishes for the Daily Mail.
Charles and Diana were the story, but Diana was box office. Diana shifted newspapers and magazines on an industrial scale. We tend to have forgotten now. She really had the power to shift publications in a way that no one has since. And we therefore were fascinated by her.
Diana knew her power over the press. Anyone could be won over. About a year before she died, Princess Diana's secretary rang me up and invited me to lunch. I've no idea why the invitation was issued. I guess she just knew that anyone she invited would be more or less certain to come. She was stunningly glamorous, as you can imagine. We talked about our children, and she said William often told her he didn't really want to be king. And then Harry would say, well, if you don't want the job, I'll have it. I thought she was pretty lonely, really. As we were leaving, I said, what a strange place this is. It's so quiet, and yet over there is all the bustle of Kensington High Street. It's a bit like a prison. And she said, no, Jeremy, not like a prison at all. More like an upmarket Coronation Street. As we go out, you'll see all the curtains twitching. Well, I wouldn't be a royal if you paid me.
This morning, shocking news that Diana, the Princess of Wales, has died.
When I heard that Princess Diana had died, I'm ashamed to say that my initial reaction was, you're joking. Like all news broadcasters, I'd had to practice what we would do in the event of the Queen Mother dying, which we all took to be a rehearsal for the Queen's death. But Diana? Unimaginable.
The public mood was most extraordinary. Somebody described it as mob grief. Charles, I think, said specifically, I'm going to get the blame for this.
Charles had been unpopular before. Now he was one of the most despised cads in the world. And that anger wasn't reserved just for him, but for the entire royal family.
I think it's disgusting that they have not appeared or said a word. I think it's a disgrace on the whole royal family.
There's no doubt that the senior members of the royal family, all the members of the royal family, were very shocked by the public reaction to Princess Diana's death. They were shocked by it and didn't really understand it.
Giles Brandreth knows Prince Philip and is a royal biographer.
There was that sense of revulsion amongst the public. You know, you don't care, you're heartless.
For the first time, really almost for the first time in her whole reign, people were being critical of the Queen.
Luckily, Edward and Andrew are still in London, so the war hero and his Royal Marine dropout brother are sent out on their most dangerous mission yet.
Now, I knew that both Andrew and Edward were in London.
Dickie Arbiter was the palace press secretary who ordered the brothers out into the mall to appease the public.
I phoned up Prince Edward. I asked him, are you going to work? And he said, yes. I said, well, on the way to work, I'd like you to drop in and look at the books of condolence. I'll come with you. And his first reaction was, is anybody going to see me? Quite understandable, because they were not immune to the hostile press either. He said, no, I'm not going to go. I'm going to go with my brother this afternoon. And I was, pretty brassed off. And I asked him to come down, and I said, this afternoon is too late. I want you to go this morning, and this morning you will go. And he sort of looked at me and said, yeah, I'm serious.
You were telling a member of the royal family what to do?
I was telling a member of the royal family what to do. I was pretty fed up by then.
Edward became the first senior member of the royal family to sign a condolence book in Diana's memory. Princes Andrew and Edward amid London's huge grieving crowd.
See you, sir.
Talking to some of those drawn to the capital to pay respects to Diana, the first clear personal response by the royal family to the criticism voiced since her death.
The Queen's youngest children made it back to the palace unscathed, but that was about the only good news for the royal family.
They really had to do something to address the popularity, not just of the Prince of Wales, which was absolutely on the floor, but also the whole approach to monarchy. It was still rather distant. The only one who has sort of brought it down to a human level had been Diana, and she had been mocked, roundly mocked, by her husband's family.
But they were very sensitive. They knew somehow they'd got it wrong. And the Queen is aware when she gets it wrong.
Charles had to act fast. If he didn't, there was speculation there might not even be a crown for him to inherit. Diana's death seemed to have changed everything, including the press.
The media was very chastened by Princess Diana's death. We had been blamed for publishing the paparazzi pictures, therefore encouraging the paparazzi to pursue Diana, and a lot of people thought the press had a hand in her death. So the press were willing to be used, and I recall within only a few weeks of Diana's death, Charles went off on a trip to South Africa, a normal standard royal tour.
The heir to the throne continued his royal duties, but with one difference. Charles took Prince Harry with him.
People had got that image of Harry at his mother's funeral, that terrified young boy, and now we were being told, well, all's right in this world. Charles is being a good father and he's making time for them. And Charles, what's more, who had not engaged with the press for years at this stage, joshed a little with us.
The royal party toasted their arrival at a Zulu village school with a couple of cautious sips from a huge bowl of beer. Both father and son are now honorary Zulus.
It was a masterstroke, really.
With the success of this tour, it seemed Charles realized the impact his sons could have on the public. They now became central to his plan to rebuild his popularity and the monarchies with a new idea of what the royal family might be.
His vision is for a slimmed-down version of the royal family, concentrating on a handful of figures. He wants the monarchy in the future to be concentrated on him and his sons.
In Charles's new regime, there were to be no more scandals. The trouble was, not everyone got the memo. Prince Andrew has always been in a slightly curious position in the royal family.
Andrew was the spare, so for a good bit of his life, he was very important. He was the number two, the Queen's second son, and if anything had happened to Charles, it was going to be Andrew who would take over.
Did Prince Charles or anyone close to him ever give you any indication of how he felt towards Prince Andrew?
Charles said that the trouble with my brother Andrew is that he wants to be me.
As his older brother's family grew, that wasn't going to happen. Would you wish the role of being the spare on anyone you love?
Personally, no, I wouldn't. Having seen it, I wouldn't. But I would say this, it is a role of great privilege and great perks with not too many responsibilities.
Luckily, Andy had the Navy to keep him out of trouble. So when he left in 2001, the spare was potentially something of a loose cannon. With a near £250,000 allowance from Mummy, most people expected this now aging Playboy prince to spend his time working on his golf swing. Instead, the Duke of York ended up the centre of a scandal of international dimensions.
Are you going to resign, Prince Andrew? You're an embarrassment, sir.
And in Prince Charles's firing line. In the wake of Princess Diana's death, the Queen's eldest son had got his work cut out to rehabilitate the monarchy's image, and the Queen's other children weren't his only problem.
People had fallen in love with Diana, and Prince Charles had betrayed his wife, and they didn't like it. And they blamed Camilla, and she was seen as the villain of the piece, almost a pantomime, wicked lady. But I think Prince Charles thought, I am going to be the king one day in the fullness of time, And I do want Camilla at my side. We must find a way to make this work. She was non-negotiable.
But just when Charles thought he might have been making headway on Camilla's rehabilitation, the ghost of Diana came back to haunt him. In 2002, Diana's former butler, Paul Burrell, faced prosecution for stealing hundreds of personal items belonging to the princess. It was feared that were Burrell to be cross-examined, he might spill lurid details of the royal family's private life. Just as Burrell was about to take to the witness stand, the trial suddenly collapsed. Something extraordinary had emerged. The palace felt compelled to issue a statement explaining what had happened. The Queen was in the back of one of the royal limos on her way to a memorial service when she suddenly remembered that Burrell had asked her for permission to remove some items. The case was dropped.
Congratulations. How do you feel?
So did the Queen intervene to rescue her eldest son? You can make your own judgment. I couldn't possibly comment. While the Queen's action might have saved some embarrassment for Charles, Princess Anne needed no such help.
As you know, when Cherie Blair first met her and said, call me Cherie, and she said, no, I think it'd be better if I called you Mrs. Blair. She,
Anne sort of kind of gets on with it. She's a no-nonsense lady, a bit like her dad, chip off the old block.
In fact, Princess Anne is the hardest working member of the entire royal family. In 2017, she chalked up an astounding 455 official appearances here in the UK and another 85 overseas. That's more than Wills, Kate and Harry combined. Anne is grand, but she's managed to give the impression of doing things on her own terms.
I know that the Queen wanted her children to have titles. The Queen wanted to invest Mark Phillips, her first husband, with a title when they married, and that was back in 1973. But she was absolutely clear, no, my children are just going to be plain Mr. and Miss.
The Queen didn't give up trying to reward hard-working Anne. When Charles first married, his wife outranked her. Princess Anne had to curtsy to Diana. In 1987, the Queen bestowed one of the rarest titles of all on her only daughter, the Princess Royal. As Prince Charles begins to emerge as the #1 royal child, the Queen seeks to give special status to her daughter. She makes Princess Anne the Lord High Commissioner of the Church of Scotland.
The Princess Royal.
Do you want the crown? Now, I rather doubt that Princess Anne, who's a straightforward, no-nonsense, dog-loving countrywoman, I rather doubt she felt she needed the Queen's protection. Go on. In fact, this model royal would end up being prosecuted in her name. In April 2002, while Princess Anne was out walking her English bull terrier Dottie in Great Windsor Park, the dog bit 2 young boys. She was charged under the Dangerous Dogs Act, and the case of Regina versus Lawrence was heard here at Slough Magistrates Court. She insists that her bull terrier Dottie is a good-natured sort of beast, despite the fact he's bitten 2 children. But she's convicted, and in so doing, the exemplary Princess Anne becomes the first modern royal to acquire a criminal record. Like the rest of us, Prince Charles seemed slightly intimidated by his sister, but he had no such problems with his brothers, especially the youngest.
Charles is 16 years older than Edward. They weren't close.
Ingrid Stewart is Prince Edward's biographer.
He probably only saw him in the summer at Balmoral. And on one of those occasions, Prince Edward went upstairs and he found some of the Duke of Windsor's old kilts, which of course were in all the tartans that the Prince of Wales is entitled to wear. And he thought, ooh, those look rather fun. So he put one on and it fitted. So he went down to dinner, and it was the tartan of the Duke of Rothesay. And as he walked into the dining room, Charles went apoplectic. He said, "What are you doing wearing that kilt? I am the only person entitled to wear that kilt. It is a kilt for the Prince of Wales. Go upstairs and take it off." And Edward, being such a calm person, he just said, "OK," went upstairs and took it off, never mentioned it again.
How extraordinary that Prince of Wales would recognise his own tartan.
Oh, good heavens, of course he would.
Would he?
Yes.
Do you think he recognised
all of them? Yes.
Really?
Yes. And the Rothesay tartan is particularly nice.
That's probably why Edward chose it.
Yes.
Neither the heir nor the spare. No one's paid too much attention to Edward.
At Buckingham Palace, he was lonely. I mean, 1 year on his birthday, he went to have breakfast with the Queen, and nothing was said. No card, no present.
She didn't mention it was his birthday?
She didn't know it was his birthday. It's an absolutely true story, so make of it what you will.
But being fourth gave Edward a lot more freedom than his siblings not to follow the royal rules, ditching the military for a career in showbiz.
The trouble with Edward, as Charles's aides once put it to me, is that he can't decide whether he is His Royal Highness or Edward Windsor. You know, he was, call me Ed, well, actually no, call me Sir. He couldn't decide really whether he was normal, one of us, or a member of the royal family.
In 1993, Prince Edward launched his own television production company, Ardent.
What sort of programme ideas have you got, sir? Well, I'm not going to tell you that, am I?
He was desperate to get his television company, Ardent, going, and that was his priority. He said, "I'm not going to do any more royal tours or royal jobs. My priority is to get Ardent going."
You're not going to see a slew of programmes about royalty, he says. That's not the idea at all. Ardent gives us Edward on Edward, presented by Edward. Windsor Restored, produced by Edward. And Crown and Country, starring, you guessed it, Edward. Oh, and a little thing for Channel 4 on sex and disability called Forbidden Pleasures, just to prove he's really diverse.
Ardent bombed, didn't it?
It didn't bomb straight away. They made several programmes,
including a documentary about his great-uncle Edward VIII. Now, just about any fool can present a television programme, but it was too much for Edward. He even got wrong how old George VI was when he died, and that's his own grandfather.
Yet, he continued to remain optimistic, especially about his prospects for a job.
When he made the programmes he made, people criticised him and said, "Well, of course you made Edward on Edward. Of course you made a film about the royal palaces because you've got access."
Even his own brother Charles reportedly had his doubts about Edward's job.
The confetti is flying as the people of Windsor see Edward and Sophie.
In 1999, Edward married Sophie Rhys-Jones from the vapid world of PR. His brothers Charles and Andrew acted as best men.
And you can see in the second landau, Prince Charles, Prince Andrew. That was unexpected.
Despite his mother making him and his new bride, the Earl and Countess of Wessex, on the morning of their wedding, Call Me Ed was determined they would keep working.
The Wessexes have been trying, they really have. Edward's wife, Sophie, wants to keep her job at her PR company, but she gets caught in a sting by the news of the world's fake sheikh. She's caught on tape, apparently bad-mouthing all sorts of people, from Tony Blair to the Queen.
It's just the sort of scandal Charles feared.
Actually, the comments aren't that bad.
But they gave Charles ammunition against his brother that would come in handy just a few months later. By 2001, despite losses approaching £2 million, Ardent Productions was still a going concern and filming the arrival of Edward's nephew at St Andrews University.
Now, at that particular time, Prince Edward's Ardent Company had got themselves involved with the E Channel, the A to Z of royalty. Pretty ghastly series of programmes, but there you go.
Dickie Arbiter was a consultant on the series.
What happens when a younger member of the royal family goes to university or to school? There's always a facility, photographers, for television cameras and for reporters to witness what is happening. And the agreement was when William arrived at St Andrews in Scotland, once he disappeared into the building, that was it. Everybody go.
And the one camera crew that hung around at St Andrews after we had all long gone was an outfit employed by Prince Edward.
I got a phone call from various media hacks saying, what is Arden doing there? Is there one rule for the royals and one rule for the rest of us?
It's a sense of entitlement that members of the royal family have, an arrogance that they can, that the normal rules don't apply to them.
And I got hold of the producer up there to no buts, no ifs, go immediately. Otherwise, you will be lifted off by the police. End of.
William was alerted about this. He complained to his father, and I believe there was a big row with him and his younger brother about it.
This time, a furious Charles reportedly wanted Edward either to keep his title but work only as an unpaid royal, or lose it and earn a living.
In despair, Edward and Sophie decide to chuck in their jobs. They've learned one important lesson, that above all, the people want their royals to be royal.
But if the Queen's youngest son is willing to bend the knee to his older brother, there's one royal child who definitely is not. By the start of the new millennium, it seemed the country was once more warming to the monarchy, even to the Queen's eldest child. In 2005, Charles achieved something that only a few years earlier would have been unimaginable. He married Camilla.
Time solves everything. Time heals everything. In retrospect, it turns out that actually people seemed suddenly to wake up to the fact that this was a family, and that modern families do have breakdowns. They do have divorce. They do have separation, and things can go wrong. And people accepted it because that's the way it is for you, and that's the way it is for a lot of us.
The Queen didn't seem exactly overjoyed at her son's second marriage. She stood for just 52 seconds for photos. Now married to the woman he loved, there was only really one outstanding issue for Charles in his plan to save the monarchy: his brother Andrew.
How are you? Nice to see you. Are you well?
Since leaving the Navy back in 2001, the Duke of York had been representing Britain overseas as an envoy for UK trade and investment. So the whole handsome Randy Andy thing is now thrust aside, and in its place comes Air Miles Andy. One article even describes him as the most expensive, least cost-effective, most pointless member of the royal family, and that's with some competition. This is the official audit of royal travel for a single year, 2008 to 2009. So here he is in May, representing us at Sharm el-Sheikh. A cost to the taxpayer of £55,269. In September, £24,533 to Hanoi and Singapore. And in October, £113,204 to Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan and Turkmenistan. Total £419,322. Has anyone ever worked harder?
I like him. I find him intelligent and interesting, and he cares about business and tries to do a good job. And there's no point in me telling you this, because that's not the image he's got, so let's forget it.
By 2011, Chris Bryant MP definitely didn't feel the same way.
Isn't it time we dispensed with the services of the Duke of York?
Well, I was Foreign Office Minister, covering quite a large chunk of the world, including the Stan, so Kazakhstan, amongst others, and he was a semi-official trade envoy, extraordinary trade envoy, I think is the title he was given.
Did you find him at all useful?
I found him counterproductive, if I'm honest. Quite often I would get reports back from our ambassadors saying he'd just been boorish, arrogant, rude, and he insisted on a phenomenal budget. What would happen is he would turn up and insist on not just a nice room in a hotel, perfectly legitimate, but a vast suite, or indeed a whole building for himself at phenomenal cost. And if you wanted to just put in the what is Britain getting out of it for that return, you'd have to say it was negligible.
Over the course of a decade, Andrew made some very curious dealings. There were private meetings with the murderous dictator Muammar Gaddafi, the sale of his house for £3 million over the asking price to a Kazakh oligarch, and allegations of a necklace given to Princess Beatrice by a convicted Libyan gun smuggler.
Prince Andrew had a relationship with a convicted gun runner from Libya, which I thought was wholly inappropriate for a UK TI special envoy.
Amazingly, despite all this, Andy kept hold of his role.
Officials insist he has no intention of reducing his royal duties. Palace officials have always insisted Andrew's done nothing wrong and has earned millions of pounds for Britain.
You denounced Prince Andrew in the House of Commons. Did it take a lot of guts to do that?
We have a strange rule that you're not allowed to refer to members of the royal family in the House of Commons unless it's to praise them. I just about got away with it.
But there was worse to come. Just weeks later, it was revealed the Duke of York was still in contact with the American billionaire Jeffrey Epstein, despite him being a convicted sex offender. These revelations couldn't have come at a worse time for Charles, mere weeks away from William and Kate's wedding. The Queen did reportedly talk to her treasured son about his behaviour, and Andrew did resign, but it doesn't seem to have been much of a telling off.
Whenever there is a really bad story about Air Miles Andy in the press, the Queen ferrets about in her bottom drawer and finds another gong to give him.
The day after the Epstein revelations, Her Majesty invested her second son as a Knight Grand Cross of the Royal Victorian Order.
I think one can only attribute this to the fact that he is her cuddly baby.
It looks as though the Queen will always guarantee Andrew a place within the firm. But what'll happen when she's no longer around? As the Sunday Times royal correspondent, Roya Nicker has seen Charles's vision of the future.
I think the Diamond Jubilee celebrations were really interesting. What was particularly notable was at the climax, where you had the Queen appearing on the royal balcony at Buckingham Palace, that very famous balcony, with the Prince of Wales, Duchess of Cornwall, William, Kate and Harry, 6 members of the royal family. That was a very pared down, stripped back version of balcony appearances. If you look back to the Golden Jubilee, 2002, there were 12. And I think that sent a very clear message of the future of the monarchy. And I think that was the Queen and probably the Prince of Wales sending a very strong message of this is the core. These people are who are going to be at the heart of what the monarchy means going forwards.
The monarchy survives by not being in the headlines. But for all that, this glossier version of us will always be the subject of fascination. Hello follows their every move, selling nearly 250,000 copies a week. Despite all the embarrassments over the years, it's a magazine that virtually guarantees the royals a good news story. What's going on in this photograph here where Prince Edward appears to be wearing some sort of bedsheet? Yeah. Rosie Nixon is editor-in-chief. And what's happened in this is an earlier one where she's first outed as going out with Prince Edward, isn't she?
Yeah. So
and
that's
then
94,
this later one,
yeah,
she starts looking like Princess Diana. Does the Queen read hello?
We believe that we are read in all royal households. We are always there in historic moments. So weddings are the ultimate, babies, christenings, significant birthdays.
You think it's a sort of picture album for the nation?
Yeah, I might steal that phrase.
No, you go ahead.
Yeah, it is a picture album for the nation. Yeah, documenting historic moments in a beautiful way. We're fascinated by their lives. In fact, the first edition of Hello featured a royal on the cover.
This is the one with Princess Anne.
Princess Anne in her private apartment at Buckingham Palace. And this was a huge coup for the magazine back in 1988, a royal exclusive.
Do certain kinds of royals do more for your circulation than other kinds of royals?
Yes, I mean, times have changed, obviously, during the last 30 years, and as the line of succession has changed, we've tended to put the focus on the younger generation now. Prince George and Princess Charlotte and even Prince Louis are some of our youngest and yet most popular cover stars currently.
Well, it's understandable. Who wants to look at old people?
For us, it's more about the line of succession, I would say. The wedding of the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge back in 2011 was our second highest selling issue ever in the 30 years that Hello's been published. Sold nearly 1 million copies. In a matter of days, we should have printed more.
Of course, that's how we like our royalty. Either very, very old, like Queen Victoria, or our present Queen, or very, very young, like Prince Charles when he was a baby, or even Prince Louis, Prince William's son. The challenge are the middle years.
We're all boring in middle age.
Exactly.
So now he's 70, it seems Charles at last has something to celebrate.
Or even better, scones. No, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
In Queen Elizabeth's reign, we've fallen in and out of love with the royal family. How did it happen?
All 7 decades of Charles's life have been part of an experiment. It has been one in which he and his siblings, Anne, Andrew and Edward, have taken their place in the spotlight alongside their mother, the Queen.
The royal family realizes it can never undo the decision to let the press in, made by the Queen all those decades ago. The real success of Charles's plan is how it's enabled him to re-establish control of the royal family's image. Reporters are cowed.
I think the press are now much more respectful of members of the royal family when it comes to privacy, but it's something that the royal family have got much stricter on.
Do you think that allows the royals to get away with things?
Possibly. I know for a fact there are certain stories that have never appeared that probably would have appeared 30 years ago.
The Prince of Wales's relationship with the press has done a complete 180. The Sun even threw him a 70th birthday tea party.
Of course, was quite right. He used to creep about in the undergrowth. It's amazing how life changes as you go along.
The future of the royal family will be all about Charles and his immediate heirs. For his siblings, the gravy train is heading for a siding.
Do you think Prince Andrew sort of resents being marginalised?
He may have not been thrilled to have had to give up things like being UK trade ambassador. I suspect he wasn't thrilled at not being on the balcony in 2012. But at the same time, I think he still sees himself as a full-time working royal who's supporting the monarch.
I mean, Prince Andrew's daughters, they're the only blood royal princesses of their generation. They're HRHs. In the ordinary course of events, they would by now have had key roles within the firm, but they have not been given those roles, largely, I believe, because Prince Charles has been against it.
I'm not sure you'd want to be Prince Edward now, would you?
I don't know. I mean, maybe he's...
Sell his shares in him, eh?
I think he's quite content. Actually, he's happy enough, I think.
Prince Edward, when the Duke of Edinburgh dies, we know will be recreated Duke of Edinburgh. Well, if you're the Queen, you can't get closer to someone than saying to your youngest son, you will be what Daddy has been these last 70 years.
Princess Anne, I think, will always have a role because she's the only woman. She's been head of the Save the Children Fund, a very important charity for many years, and I think we appreciate that. He's respected. The monarchy would do well if they just settled on respect without having to have love and adoration.
One great unknown remains. What will Charles be like as king? And after that, his son,